Chapter 1. The Outcast Princess. The Sithian Empire spanned countless systems, its reach extending into the farthest corners of known space. Renowned for their physical elegance and intellectual superiority, the Sithians prided themselves on their advanced genetics. For millennia, their meticulous breeding practices had ensured a nearly flawless population. But beneath the empire's shimmering facade lay a hidden crisis: genetic stagnation. Their once perfect DNA, carefully curated over generations, was faltering. Birth rates had plummeted, and the offspring that were born often suffered from debilitating weaknesses. At the heart of this crisis was Princess Lyra Cirith, the youngest daughter of Emperor Kale Cirith. With her striking violet skin, radiant silver hair, and golden eyes that seemed to glow, Lyra embodied the physical perfection of her race. Yet, she carried a secret burden. Despite her beauty and royal lineage, Lyra's body had rejected every suitor the Empire had presented to her. The Sithian compatibility matrix, a sophisticated biological mechanism within their DNA, deemed all her potential mates unworthy. It was a scandal that echoed through the halls of the celestial Spire, the Sithian imperial palace. The whispers of the court were unrelenting. "The princess is defective," some murmured. "She'll never bear an heir," others claimed. For Lyra, each failed pairing felt like another crack in her already fragile sense of self-worth. A desperate demand. "You must try again," Emperor Kale demanded, his tone sharper than Lyra had ever heard. They stood in his private chamber, surrounded by holographic maps of the Empire and projections of its dwindling population statistics. Lyra's heart sank as she met her father's piercing gaze. "Father, I've tried. I've endured every genetic test, every ritual pairing, every invasive procedure. None of them." She hesitated, her voice trembling. "None of them are strong enough." The Emperor's expression softened for a brief moment, but frustration quickly overtook him. "Do you understand what's at stake, Lyra? The Empire's survival depends on the strength of our bloodlines. If you cannot fulfill your duty dash—" "I know my duty," Lyra snapped, surprising both herself and her father. She took a deep breath, her hands trembling. "I'm sorry," she added softly, "but I can't force my body to accept what it rejects." The room fell silent. The Emperor's shoulders slumped slightly, the weight of his burden apparent. "Then perhaps the fault lies not in you, but in the weakness of our people," he muttered. "We have bred for perfection for so long that we've forgotten how to adapt." As Lyra left the chamber, her father's words lingered in her mind. Was it possible that the Sithians' obsession with purity had doomed them? The arrival of a stranger. 2 weeks later, the palace received an unexpected visitor. A Terran ambassador, Ethan Carter, had arrived from the United Earth Coalition to negotiate a trade agreement. Humans were relatively new to the intergalactic stage, and many Sithians viewed them as primitive and unrefined. Yet, the humans had proven themselves to be resourceful and adaptable, traits that intrigued Emperor Kale. Lyra first encountered Ethan during a formal banquet in the Grand Hall of the Celestial Spire. She sat at the far end of the table, largely ignored by the court as they fawned over her siblings, each of whom had successfully produced heirs. Ethan, seated across from her, seemed equally out of place. His plain features and simple attire stood in stark contrast to the opulence around him. Yet, there was something about him that caught Lyra's attention. Ethan noticed her gaze and offered a small, polite smile. "Princess Lyra, isn't it?" he asked, his Terran accent soft but clear. She nodded, surprised that he even knew her name. "You're observant for an outsider," she replied, her tone guarded. He chuckled. "It's my job to observe. Though I admit, you stand out in a room like this." Lyra raised an eyebrow. "Do I?" "Absolutely," Ethan said, his gaze unwavering. "You look human." The comment caught her off guard. Was it a compliment? An insult? She wasn't sure. "And you look unremarkable," she retorted, a faint smile playing at her lips. Ethan laughed, a sound that drew the attention of nearby guests. "Fair enough. But in my experience, unremarkable can be deceiving." A surprising connection. Over the next few days, Lyra found herself crossing paths with Ethan more often. He seemed genuinely curious about Sithian culture, asking questions that few others dared to. Despite her initial reservations, Lyra found herself drawn to his unassuming nature and dry humor. One evening, they walked together through the palace gardens, their conversation drifting to the subject of genetics. "So, your people select mates based on compatibility matrices?" Ethan asked, his brow furrowed. "That sounds clinical." "It's more than that," Lyra explained. "The matrix ensures that our offspring inherit the strongest traits. It's why our species has thrived for so long." "Until now," Ethan said gently. Lyra hesitated, the weight of her failures pressing down on her. "Until now," she admitted. "My body rejects every mate the matrix selects for me. It's as if something inside me knows they're not enough." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe the problem isn't you. Maybe it's the system." Lyra looked at him, her golden eyes searching his face. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Ethan said, "maybe your body is looking for something different. Something the matrix can't account for." The thought lingered in Lyra's mind long after their conversation ended. An unlikely experiment. The turning point came a week later, during a meeting of the Imperial Council. Lyra, seated silently at the edge of the chamber, listened as the elders debated the future of the Empire. Frustrated by their lack of solutions, Emperor Kale finally turned to his daughter. "Lyra," he said, his voice heavy with desperation, "do you believe there's any way to solve this crisis?" Lyra hesitated, her mind racing. Then, to everyone's surprise, she spoke. "What if we looked outside our own kind?" The room erupted in outrage. The idea of mixing Sithian blood with another species was unthinkable, but Lyra held her ground. "Our obsession with purity is killing us," she said, her voice steady. "If we don't adapt, we'll die out." Emperor Kale regarded her for a long moment. "And who do you propose as a candidate for such an experiment?" Lyra's heart pounded as she answered. "The human ambassador, Ethan Carter." A shocking proposal. Ethan was summoned to the council chamber the following day. He stood before the elders, visibly confused but composed. "Mr. Carter," Emperor Kale began, "our species faces a crisis that threatens our survival. Princess Lyra has suggested a unique solution, one that involves you." Ethan glanced at Lyra, who avoided his gaze. "I'm listening," he said cautiously. Kale explained the situation, his tone clinical. By the time he finished, Ethan looked stunned. "You want me to? What?" "The princess believes your genetic diversity could provide the strength our people need," Kale said. "We are asking you to participate in an experimental pairing." Ethan blinked, his mind reeling. "You're asking me to father a child with your daughter?" Kale nodded. "Precisely." Ethan turned to Lyra, his expression a mix of disbelief and curiosity. "Is this what you want?" Lyra met his gaze, her voice quiet but firm. "I don't know if it will work, but I have to try." Chapter 2. The experiment begins. The chamber where the proposal had been made fell into silence. The stunned expressions of the Sithian council mirrored Ethan's own disbelief. Lyra felt every gaze on her, but she kept her eyes locked on Ethan. There was no going back now. "Ambassador Carter," Emperor Kale continued, breaking the tense quiet, "you are under no obligation to agree. However, should you choose to participate, you will be granted every comfort and assurance of safety." Ethan crossed his arms, his mind racing. He wasn't just being asked to help solve a genetic crisis, he was being asked to defy the ingrained norms of an entire empire. He turned to Lyra, his voice quieter. "Are you sure this is what you want?" Lyra nodded, her golden eyes unwavering. "I have to know if it's possible. For the sake of my people, and," she hesitated before finishing, "for myself." A contract is signed. After hours of deliberation, Ethan agreed to the arrangement, though with conditions. "I'm not just some lab experiment," he said firmly to the council. "If I'm going to do this, I need your respect and your honesty." Kale inclined his head. "Of course. You'll be treated as an honored guest, not a subject." Ethan glanced at Lyra, who gave him the faintest nod of encouragement. "All right," he said at last. "I'll do it." The council remained divided. Some elders, particularly the conservative Virith voiced their disgust. "This is blasphemy," he spat. "Our purity is our strength, and now you're asking us to dilute it with the genes of a primitive species?" Kale silenced him with a sharp glare. Enough, Virith. If you have a better solution, speak it now. Otherwise, hold your tongue. The elder fumed, but said nothing further. A formal agreement was drafted and signed, stipulating that Ethan would remain under Scythian protection throughout the process. Both he and Lyra would undergo medical evaluations to ensure compatibility, and any results would remain strictly confidential until a successful outcome was achieved. A growing bond. In the days that followed, Lyra and Ethan began the first phase of the experiment, compatibility tests. Scythian scientists conducted a series of non-invasive procedures to analyze their genetic markers, hormonal reactions, and physical compatibility. To Lyra's astonishment and the Council's dismay, the initial results were promising. "Your DNA is surprisingly adaptable," remarked Dr. Myril, the chief geneticist. The elder Scythian's glowing eyes flickered with curiosity as he reviewed the data. "The human genome has an uncanny ability to complement our weaknesses. I dare say it's robust." Ethan smirked. "I'll take that as a compliment." Despite the clinical nature of their arrangement, Lyra and Ethan found themselves spending more time together outside the lab. Ethan's humor and curiosity were a refreshing contrast to the stifling formality of Scythian culture. He asked questions no Scythian would dare, poked fun at their rigid traditions, and challenged Lyra in ways she hadn't experienced before. One evening, as they walked through the palace gardens, Ethan turned to her. "Why did you choose me?" Lyra hesitated, her fingers brushing the petals of a glowing luminous bloom. "Because you're different. The Matrix doesn't apply to you, and I thought, maybe that's what I need." Ethan smiled. "So, I'm a wild card?" She laughed softly. "Perhaps. But I also see something in you that I haven't seen in anyone else here. Strength. Resilience. You don't bow to expectations, and that's something I admire." Ethan's expression softened. "You're stronger than you give yourself credit for, Lyra. I've seen it." The words stayed with her long after they parted. The first attempt. When the compatibility tests yielded positive results, the Council reluctantly approved the next phase, a controlled reproductive trial. Ethan and Lyra were both nervous as they entered the pristine chamber where the procedure would take place. It wasn't exactly romantic. Scythian science didn't leave room for sentimentality, but there was a certain intimacy in the vulnerability they shared. "I feel like we should at least have dinner first," Ethan joked as the scientist prepared the equipment. Lyra smirked, despite her nerves. "If this works, I'll buy you the finest meal in the galaxy." The procedure itself was quick and efficient, involving a fusion of Scythian bioengineering and natural processes. Afterward, Lyra was instructed to rest while her body adjusted to the potential changes. For days, the palace was on edge. The scientists monitored Lyra closely, analyzing every fluctuation in her biometrics. Meanwhile, the Council grew increasingly anxious. "What if this fails?" Virith sneered during a private meeting. "We will have humiliated ourselves for nothing." Kale's expression was unreadable. "Then we try again, or we find another way." But when the results finally came in, the tension broke. The fertilization had succeeded. A revelation. The news sent shockwaves through the palace. Lyra's body, which had rejected every Scythian mate, had accepted Ethan's genetic contribution. The scientists were astounded, their excitement barely contained as they presented their findings to the Council. "This is unprecedented," Dr. Myril said, his voice trembling with awe. "The human genome has introduced a level of adaptability we've never seen. The offspring could be stronger, healthier, perhaps even immune to the genetic stagnation that plagues us." Kale turned to Lyra, his stern demeanor softening. "You've done well, my daughter." Lyra felt a surge of emotion she hadn't expected. For the first time in years, she wasn't a failure. She had done something no other Scythian could. But not everyone shared her triumph. Virith and his faction grew more vocal in their opposition, claiming the experiment was a threat to Scythian identity. "This is not a solution," Virith declared. "It's an abomination." Ethan, who had been standing quietly beside Lyra, finally spoke up. "You're afraid of change," he said, his tone calm but firm. "I get it. But change is the only reason humanity survived long enough to reach the stars. Maybe it's time you Scythians learn to adapt too." Virith glared at him, but Kale silenced the elder with a raised hand. "Enough. The results speak for themselves. The Empire must move forward." A new hope. As the weeks passed, Lyra's pregnancy progressed smoothly. The palace buzzed with cautious optimism, and Lyra found herself feeling something she hadn't felt in years: hope. Ethan stayed by her side, their bond deepening with each passing day. What had begun as a clinical arrangement had grown into something far more personal. They laughed together, confided in each other, and slowly began to imagine a future that neither of them had dared to dream of before. One evening, as they sat beneath the luminous blooms, Lyra placed a hand on her growing belly. "Do you think they'll accept this child?" she asked softly. Ethan covered her hand with his own. "They'll have to. Because this child isn't just Scythian or human, it's the future." Chapter 3. A Galaxy Divided. The news of Lyra's pregnancy spread far beyond the palace walls, igniting debates and controversies across the galaxy. In the Scythian Empire, where tradition and genetic purity had reigned supreme for millennia, the announcement sent shockwaves through every stratum of society. For some, it was a beacon of hope, a sign that the Empire's genetic stagnation might finally have a solution. For others, it was a betrayal of everything the Scythians held sacred. The divide. In the streets of Xylora Prime, protests erupted. Massive crowds gathered outside the celestial spire, holding banners emblazoned with slogans like "Keep Scythian blood pure" and "Reject the abomination." Inside the palace, the council chamber had become a war zone of words. Elder Virith Drin, emboldened by the public outrage, led the charge against the Emperor's decision. "This child," Virith spat, his voice echoing off the ornate walls, "is not a Scythian. It is a half-breed, a dilution of everything that makes us strong. If we allow this experiment to continue, we risk the very identity of our people." Emperor Kale stood at the head of the table, his face a mask of calm, though his tone carried an edge. "And if we do nothing? If we continue to cling to our outdated notions of purity, we will wither and die." Elder Thalaravin, one of the few progressive voices on the council, leaned forward. "This child could be the key to saving us. The genetic data from Lyra's pregnancy shows adaptability we haven't seen in centuries. Why are we fighting what could be our salvation?" The council erupted into heated arguments, but Kale raised a hand, silencing the room. "Enough. The decision has been made. The child will be born." Ethan's dilemma. While the Scythians debated the future of their empire, Ethan Carter found himself grappling with his own doubts. The growing resentment among the Scythians made his position increasingly precarious. Whispers of assassination attempts and sabotage reached his ears, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched at all times. One night, as he and Lyra walked through the gardens, Ethan voiced his concerns. "I'm starting to wonder if I made the right choice." Lyra stopped, her hand resting protectively on her belly. "What do you mean?" Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Your people don't want me here. Half of them think I'm some kind of invader, and the other half would rather see this child gone than accept me as part of your future. What if I've just made things worse for you?" Lyra stepped closer, her golden eyes fierce. "You didn't make things worse, Ethan. You gave me hope when I thought there was none. This child is proof that our people can change. And whether they like it or not, change is coming." Her words gave him a measure of comfort, but the unease remained. The galaxy reacts. The revelation of a human-Scythian hybrid didn't just stir controversy within the Empire, it sent shockwaves across the galaxy. Diplomatic channels buzzed with speculation, and media networks on dozens of worlds debated the implications. Some species, like the Valorans and Tarnathi, saw the hybrid as a potential breakthrough in interspecies cooperation. If two of the galaxy's most distinct species can create life together, one Valoran diplomat remarked, "Perhaps there is hope for greater unity among us all." Others, however, viewed it as a threat. The Drexer hegemony, a militant empire known for its aggressive stance on genetic purity, issued a chilling statement. "This abomination sets a dangerous precedent. If we allow such unions to proliferate, the galaxy will descend into chaos. We must act swiftly to ensure this does not become a trend." Rumors began circulating that the Drexer were mobilizing fleets near Scythian territory, prompting fears of an invasion. The Scythian Council convened an emergency session to address the growing threat. "We cannot afford war," Thalaravin argued. "The Drexer would crush us in our current state." Virith sneered. "And whose fault is that? If we had focused on strengthening our fleet instead of indulging in this experiment dash, Kale slammed his fist on the table. This is not the time for blame. If the Drexer attack, we must be prepared to defend ourselves. A fragile hope. As tensions escalated, Lyra found solace in the quiet moments she shared with Ethan. Despite the hostility surrounding them, their bond had deepened into something neither of them had anticipated. What had begun as a clinical arrangement had blossomed into genuine affection. One evening, as they sat beneath the glowing Loomis blooms, Lyra turned to Ethan. "Do you ever think about what happens after?" "After what?" he asked. "After the child is born. After the galaxy decides what it thinks of us." Ethan hesitated, then took her hand. "I think, no matter what happens, we'll face it together." Lyra smiled, a rare moment of peace washing over her. "I hope our child inherits your courage. And I hope they inherit your stubbornness," Ethan replied with a grin. "They'll need it." The attack. The fragile peace was shattered one night when the palace's defenses were breached. A squad of Drexer assassins infiltrated the celestial spire, their mission clear: eliminate the human and his unborn child. The attack came without warning. Alarms blared through the halls as Sithian guards scrambled to respond. Ethan and Lyra were in their quarters when the first explosion rocked the palace. Ethan grabbed a weapon from the emergency supply and turned to Lyra. "We need to move. Now." They navigated the chaos, dodging collapsing debris and narrowly avoiding the assassin's path. When they reached a secure chamber, Ethan barricaded the door and turned to Lyra. "Stay here. I'll hold them off." "No," Lyra said firmly, her hand gripping his arm. "We do this together." The assassins breached the door moments later, their hulking forms filling the room. But they hadn't anticipated the ferocity of their prey. Ethan fought with the precision of a seasoned soldier, while Lyra used her Sithian strength and agility to outmaneuver the attackers. When the last Drexer fell, bleeding out on the chamber floor, Ethan and Lyra stood side by side, bloodied but unbroken. "We're not safe here," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "We need to find Kale." A galaxy on the brink. The Drexer attack galvanized the Sithians. Even those who had opposed the experiment began to rally behind Lyra and Ethan, recognizing the threat posed by external forces. The Council, for the first time in decades, united in its resolve. As the Empire prepared for a potential war, Lyra and Ethan found themselves at the center of a movement that was far larger than themselves. Their child, still months from being born, had become a symbol of hope, resilience, and defiance. But the Drexer weren't finished. Their fleets began massing at the borders, and whispers of a full-scale invasion filled the galaxy. Chapter 4. The Birth of a New Era. The attack on the Celestial Spire had left the Sithian Empire reeling. While the palace was fortified and the assassins defeated, the Drexer hegemony's brazen assault had confirmed what many feared. A full-scale invasion was imminent. At the center of the storm, Lyra and Ethan stood as unlikely symbols of unity and resilience. With their unborn child seen as a potential key to the Empire's survival, the stakes had never been higher. A war council. Emperor Kale Sirith called an emergency council meeting, attended by both Sithian leaders and representatives of allied species, including the Valorans, Tarnathi, and even a delegation from the Earth Federation. Kale stood before the assembly, his voice resonating with authority. The Drexer have declared war, not just on the Sithian Empire, but on the very concept of unity. They fear what this child represents: a future where strength comes from diversity, not isolation. The room erupted into murmurs of agreement, though tension still lingered. General Torin Vyr, a seasoned Sithian military leader, stepped forward. "Our fleets are spread thin. We cannot hope to match the Drexer in a direct confrontation." Kale turned to Admiral Rinaldan of the Earth Federation, a grizzled human with a sharp gaze. "Admiral, can your forces assist us?" Alden nodded. "The Federation has pledged its support. We'll deploy a task force to reinforce your borders. But make no mistake, this will be a fight for survival." As plans were laid, Ethan watched from the sidelines, feeling the weight of his newfound responsibility. He wasn't a soldier anymore, but his role in this conflict was undeniable. He glanced at Lyra, who sat quietly at the Emperor's side, her hand resting protectively on her belly. Despite her calm exterior, he could see the strain in her eyes. The final days of peace. In the days leading up to the Drexer assault, Lyra and Ethan found solace in the quiet moments they shared. Their bond had deepened, forged by the challenges they had faced together. Yet, the uncertainty of the future loomed over them. One evening, as they sat in a secluded corner of the palace gardens, Lyra turned to Ethan. "Do you ever wonder if we're making a mistake, bringing a child into this chaos?" Ethan reached out, taking her hand in his. "I used to, but then I realized something. This child isn't just a symbol, it's a chance. A chance to show the galaxy that we're stronger together than we are apart." Lyra smiled faintly, though her golden eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I hope you're right." The invasion. The Drexer fleet arrived in Sithian space like a storm, their massive warships blotting out the stars. The battle began with devastating ferocity, as both sides clashed in a struggle for survival. The Valorans and Tarnathi fought valiantly alongside the Sithian and Federation forces, but the Drexer's superior numbers and firepower made them a formidable enemy. Within the palace, Lyra remained under heavy guard, her presence a beacon of hope for the embattled empire. Ethan, however, couldn't sit idly by. He volunteered to join a strike team tasked with infiltrating the Drexer flagship, the Maelstrom, and disabling its command systems. A bold plan. The infiltration mission was a desperate gamble. If successful, it would cripple the Drexer fleet's coordination and give the Allied forces a fighting chance. Ethan joined a team of elite operatives, including Tala Grix, the Valoran shield specialist, and Nyx Vrel, the Tarnathi infiltrator whose hive mind abilities had proven invaluable. As they approached the Maelstrom in a cloaked shuttle, Ethan couldn't help but think of Lyra and their child. The thought of leaving them behind filled him with dread, but he pushed the fear aside. This mission was their best hope. The infiltration went smoothly at first, with Nyx disabling the ship's external sensors and Tala's shields absorbing enemy fire. But as they reached the central command core, an alarm blared. The Drexer had detected their presence. "Time to move," Ethan shouted, his weapon blazing as Drexer soldiers poured into the corridor. A desperate fight. The battle within the Maelstrom was brutal. Ethan fought with the precision of a seasoned soldier, his movements honed by years of training. Tala's shields flickered under the relentless assault, while Nyx used her agility to outmaneuver their attackers. Despite the odds, the team reached the command core. As Tala held off the advancing Drexer forces, Nyx worked quickly to plant the explosives that would disable the ship systems. "Almost there," Nyx shouted, her voice strained. Ethan covered her, his pulse racing. The room shook as the Drexer ship unleashed another barrage on the Allied fleet. Time was running out. Victory at a cost. The explosives detonated just as the team made their escape, sending shockwaves through the Maelstrom. The Drexer flagship went dark, its systems crippled. The Allied fleet seized the opportunity, launching a coordinated assault that turned the tide of the battle. But the victory came at a cost. Tala fell in the final moments, her shields unable to withstand the Drexer's onslaught. Ethan carried her lifeless body back to the shuttle, his heart heavy with grief. When the battle ended, the Drexer fleet retreated, their forces broken. The Allied forces had won, but the scars of the conflict would remain. The birth of a new era. Back on Xylora Prime, Lyra went into labor just days after the battle. The palace was filled with anticipation as the Empire's future hung in the balance. Ethan stayed by her side, his hand clasping hers as she fought through the pain. When the child was born, a healthy boy with violet skin and piercing blue eyes, cheers erupted throughout the palace. The child was a symbol of hope, a living testament to the strength that came from unity. Emperor Kale held his grandson for the first time, his stern demeanor softening. "He is more than we could have hoped for," he said. "He is the future." A galactic shift. The birth of Lyra and Ethan's child marked a turning point for the galaxy. The Sithian Empire began to embrace the idea of diversity, forging new alliances and breaking free from the constraints of tradition. The child, named Kalen in honor of his grandfather, became a unifying figure, celebrated by species across the galaxy. Ethan and Lyra remained at the center of this transformation, their bond serving as a reminder that true strength came from connection, not division. Together, they faced the challenges of rebuilding a fractured empire and preparing for the future. The legacy. As the years passed, Kalen grew into a strong and compassionate leader, embodying the best traits of both his parents. Under his guidance, the galaxy began to heal, its inhabitants learning to embrace the differences that once divided them. And in the hearts of all who had witnessed it, the story of Lyra, Ethan, and their extraordinary child became a legendary tale of courage, love, and the power of unity.